What if I told you that history left behind a pattern so quiet, so precise, that it hid in plain sight for centuries? A pattern that doesn't scream, it doesn't announce itself, it simply disappears. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. In Virginia, old records still exist. Plantation logs, census lists, estate papers, names written in careful ink, ages noted year after year, children counted, tallied, tracked. But something strange begins to happen when you follow those names closely, especially the youngest ones. You see them listed at age 6, then 7, then 10, then 11, and then 12, and after that, nothing. No sale record, no death notice, no transfer paper, no explanation, just absence, like they were erased. Because when one child disappears from a record, history often shrugs, but when hundreds vanish at the exact same age, across different counties, across different plantations, across different years, that is not chance, that is design. Age 12 was not just another birthday. In the world of slavery, it marked a threshold, a moment when childhood officially ended, when value was recalculated, when bodies were no longer seen as growing lives, but as usable assets. And that is where the paper trail begins to break. What makes this disturbing is not only that these children vanished, it's that they vanished without being sold. In a system obsessed with profit, nothing valuable simply disappears without record. Every transaction mattered. Every dollar was logged. Every loss was explained. Except this one. In this video you will learn how historians began to notice these gaps, how patterns emerged that could not be explained by disease or migration, how silence itself became evidence, and how these missing names point to a hidden system operating beneath the official one. This is not a story most textbooks tell. It doesn't fit neatly into dates and battles. It lives in margins, in crossed-out lines, in records that stop mid-sentence. But it matters, because history is not only what was written, it is also what was deliberately left out. By the end of this video you will understand why these disappearances were not accidents, why age 12 mattered so much, and why uncovering this pattern changes how we understand control, power, and erasure in American history. Stay with me until the end, because the truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slips away quietly, and the only way to catch it is to notice who stopped being counted. Before we talk about the disappearances, we have to understand why age 12 carried so much weight in slave society. It was not just a number written next to a name. It was a signal, a line crossed, a quiet announcement that childhood, as limited as it already was officially over. In the world of plantations, age determined value. Younger children were listed, counted, and fed, but they were rarely expected to produce much. They were seen as future assets, still growing, still learning, still forming. But at around 12 the language in records begins to change. Descriptions shift. Words like boy or girl slowly disappear, replaced by terms tied to labor, hands, workers, field ready. This was the age when bodies were judged differently. Strength was measured. Endurance was tested. Owners watched closely to see who could work longer hours, carry heavier loads, or follow instructions without resistance. A child who reached 12 and showed promise was no longer just being raised, they were being prepared for extraction. Before we talk about why records go silent, we need to see how this transition was planned long in advance. Children were trained without being told they were training. They learned when to wake up, when to stay quiet, how to obey quickly, how to endure pain without complaint. By the time they reached 12, many had already been shaped for usefulness. This shift also meant a change in how time was valued. A child's mistakes might once be tolerated. At 12, errors became punishable. Slowness became defiance. Curiosity became distraction. The system had little patience for learning once productivity was expected. Age 12 also mattered because it marked the moment when future profit could finally be calculated. A younger child was an investment with uncertainty, illness, growth, survival. But at 12 the risk narrowed. Owners could now estimate output, years of labor, resale potential, specialized roles. This is why valuation lists often spike at this age, even when sale records do not follow. Before we talk about where the children went, it's important to understand that this was also the age when separation became easier to justify. Younger children were often kept near family units, not out of kindness, but practicality. Older children could be removed with less disruption, less noise, less immediate resistance. This was not accidental. The system understood psychology even if it never named it. At 12, bonds were strong enough to have shaped obedience, but not yet strong enough to inspire organized rebellion. It was a precise moment, a window. By redefining a child as a labor asset, the system also stripped away the last protection childhood offered. Once usefulness replaced innocence, everything changed. How they were treated, how they were moved, how easily they could disappear from one ledger and never appear in another. Before we talk about the meaning of disappearance, we have to look closely at the records themselves. Plantation logs, censuses and estate papers were not casual notes, they were tools of control. Every name had a purpose. Every age, every skill, every body was accounted for because ownership depended on documentation. Plantation logs were often updated yearly, sometimes more often. They listed enslaved people by name, age and perceived value. Children appeared alongside adults, usually marked simply by age and gender. As years passed, those same names would reappear, aging 1 year at a time. This consistency is what makes the gaps so unsettling. A name present for a decade suddenly stops appearing, without explanation. Census records reinforce this pattern. Federal and state censuses counted enslaved populations carefully, not by name in all cases, but by age brackets and household totals. When those numbers are compared year to year, something becomes clear. The expected progression is broken. The group of 12-year-olds does not age into 13-year-olds in the next count. The numbers shrink, but no corresponding increase appears elsewhere. Estate papers deepen the mystery. When an enslaver died, their property was inventoried in detail. Land, tools, animals, furniture and enslaved people were all listed because they were considered assets to be divided or sold. Children were often named individually, especially once they reached working age. Yet in many estates, children listed shortly before age 12 are missing from the final inventories. What makes this absence impossible to ignore is what is not written. There are no death notations. Death was expensive. Loss of property required explanation, especially when estates were settled among heirs. There are also no sale records. Sales left trails, bills of sale, newspaper advertisements, auction notices, receipts. These children appear in none of them. Transfers between plantations usually left some mark as well. Even informal exchanges were often noted to avoid disputes later, but in case after case, the paper trail simply ends. No arrows pointing forward, no footnotes, just silence. Before we talk about intention, it's important to understand how unusual this is. The slave system was obsessed with order. Chaos meant lost profit. Missing assets meant conflict. Documentation protected owners, not the enslaved. So when the system suddenly stops documenting, it raises a serious question. Why abandon the very thing it relied on? Some historians once assumed poor record keeping. But that explanation collapses when the same pattern appears across multiple plantations, run by different families, in different regions, at different times. The consistency suggests something else, a practice so normalized that it no longer required explanation. These records were never meant to tell the truth. They were meant to protect power, and sometimes, the easiest way to protect power was not to lie, but to leave nothing behind at all. Before we talk about what really happened, we have to examine the excuses that were most often given. When questions did arise, enslavers leaned on simple explanations: illness, relocation, natural loss. These words were used like doors, quickly shut, never reopened. Illness was the most common answer. Records would vaguely mention fever, weakness, or sudden sickness, but these claims rarely came with dates, witnesses or burial notes. In a system that tracked productivity so closely, death from illness should have left marks: reduced output, medical expenses, replacement costs. Yet in many cases none of these appear. When historians compared plantation logs, the illness explanation began to fall apart. Children of the same age vanished in different counties during the same periods. If disease were responsible, there would be clusters, spikes, patterns tied to outbreaks. Instead, the disappearances followed age, not season. Year after year, 12-year-olds vanished, while younger and older children remained. Relocation was the second excuse. Enslavers claimed children were moved to other properties, sent to relatives, transferred for work, but relocation usually increased documentation, not reduced it. A move meant adjusting inventories, updating labor counts, and protecting ownership rights. Yet these supposed relocations left no receiving records, no new listings, no acknowledgments. When plantation records are placed side by side, another problem emerges. The number of children leaving does not match the number arriving elsewhere. There is no corresponding rise in adolescent enslaved populations on neighboring plantations. The math does not work. People vanish, but they do not reappear. Before we talk about intention, it's important to see how consistent this failure is. Different owners used the same vague language. Different record keepers left the same blanks. It suggests that these explanations were not meant to be investigated. They were meant to end conversation. Illness and relocation also served another purpose. They removed responsibility. Illness made loss seem unavoidable. Relocation made it seem administrative. Neither demanded moral reckoning. Neither invited scrutiny. They allowed the system to continue without interruption. But when these explanations are tested against evidence, they collapse. Cemeteries do not reflect the deaths. Medical logs do not show the treatments. Population data does not support mass sickness. And relocation fails because ownership trails disappear entirely. What remains is a pattern of convenience. When a child was young, they were visible, counted, named. Once they reached a certain age, explanation replaced evidence. Words replaced proof. And silence became policy. These excuses were not accidents. They were tools. And like all tools in that system, they were used to hide what could not be openly defended. Before we talk about where the children might have gone, we have to look at where they should have appeared. In a system built on surveillance and profit, absence from public notices is not neutral. It is revealing. Runaway ads were everywhere in Virginia. Newspapers were filled with them. They described clothing, scars, speech patterns, height, skin tone, even personality. Enslavers used these ads to recover what they considered stolen property. Children who ran away were often mentioned, especially if they were strong enough to travel or old enough to be useful. Yet when researchers searched these papers, something strange appeared. The missing 12-year-olds were not there. If these children had fled, their names or descriptions should have surfaced. Even a single ad would suggest panic or loss. But instead the papers remain quiet. Not one pattern of search. Not a wave of desperate notices. Just silence. Sale notices tell a similar story. Auctions were public, loud, designed to attract buyers and raise prices. When enslaved children were sold, they were listed, sometimes in groups, sometimes individually. Age was always mentioned because it affected value. 12-year-olds standing at the edge of peak usefulness would have been attractive to buyers. Yet they are missing from sale listings too. Before we talk about meaning, it's important to understand why this absence matters more than presence. If even a few of these children had appeared in ads, historians could point to chance. But when none do, across years and counties, chance disappears. Presence would mean disorder, escape, market exchange, something visible. Absence suggests control. If children were sold quietly, why avoid records? If they ran away, why avoid recovery? If they died, why avoid accounting? Newspapers were not optional tools, they were essential. Enslavers relied on them to protect investments. Ignoring them would mean accepting loss. That did not happen casually. That did not happen often. When compared across plantations, the pattern sharpens. Different owners, different newspapers, same silence. The missing children do not appear as fugitives or commodities. They are not hunted. They are not marketed. They simply stop existing publicly. What makes this more unsettling is that public records were meant to intimidate. Runaway ads warned others not to help. Sale notices reminded communities of power. When these tools are not used, it suggests the outcome was already secured. There was nothing to chase, nothing to sell, nothing to explain. Before we talk about disappearance, we have to talk about selection, because not every child was treated the same, even when the records pretend they were. Long before age 12 arrived, some children were already being watched more closely than others. These children were noticed early, not because of kindness, but because of usefulness, a sharp memory, quick hands, calm behavior, the ability to listen without speaking. Enslavers paid attention to these traits, even if they never wrote them down. Potential was observed quietly. In some households, certain children were kept closer to the main house. They ran errands. They listened. They absorbed language simply by being present. Words spoken around them were different from those spoken in the fields. Tone mattered. Vocabulary mattered. Over time, these children began to understand more than they were meant to. Literacy did not always begin with books. It began with symbols, numbers, marks on crates, labels on jars. Children learned to recognize meaning before they were ever taught letters. They learned when silence was required, when speech was allowed, when repeating a phrase could earn approval instead of punishment. Before we talk about training, it's important to understand how invisible it was. No classrooms, no lessons, no written plans. Training happened through repetition, through proximity, through correction. A child might be asked to deliver a message, then another, then remember names, remember routes, remember rules that were never spoken aloud. Skilled labor training followed a similar path. A child might be assigned to observe rather than work, to watch a craftsperson, to hold tools, to prepare materials. Not enough to be listed as an apprentice, but enough to learn. Over years, these small tasks built quiet competence. Language training mattered more than we often realize. Children who could speak clearly, who understood multiple accents, who could repeat instructions exactly, became valuable in ways that did not show up on labor lists. Communication was power. Control depended on it. Before we talk about why this mattered at 12, we need to see how early this shaping began. By the time these children reached that age, they were no longer blank slates. They had been conditioned, taught restraint, taught awareness, taught to notice without being noticed. This kind of preparation did not need records. In fact, records would have exposed it. Silence protected the process. The less written down, the safer it was. What looks like ordinary childhood in the logs was often something else entirely. A quiet sorting, a slow narrowing of paths. And when the moment came, those selected children were already different from the others, even if the paper never said so. Before we talk about power, we have to talk about fear. Because the greatest fear in slave society was not loss of labor, it was collective resistance. And children played a central role in how that fear was managed. By age 12, emotional bonds were strong enough to inspire loyalty, but not yet strong enough to fuel organized rebellion. This made it a critical moment. Families had formed deep connections. Parents had taught survival. Siblings had learned to protect one another. But those bonds were still fragile. They could be broken without immediate uprising. Removing children at this age weakened multiple links at once. Parents lost hope and focus. Siblings were scattered. The next generation's sense of continuity was disrupted. Resistance depends on trust, memory, and shared identity. Taking children erased all three. Before we talk about strategy, it's important to understand how early this conditioning began. Enslaved children were raised under constant instability. Sales, threats, sudden punishments. They learned early that attachment brought pain. This made separation easier to enforce later, even when it was devastating. Emotional bonds were not broken by accident. They were tested repeatedly. Small separations, temporary assignments, nights spent away. Each break trained both child and parent to expect loss. By the time permanent removal came, shock had been replaced by numbness. This also reduced the chance of retaliation. A younger child being taken might trigger open defiance. An older adult being removed might inspire organized response. But a 12-year-old existed in a gray space, old enough to endure separation, young enough to be controlled elsewhere. Before we talk about records, we have to acknowledge how intentional this timing was. Slaveholders understood that rebellion grew from networks. Families were networks. Communities were networks. Removing children severed future connections before they could solidify. Children taken at this age could be reshaped, their identities rewritten, their loyalties redirected. Without strong family anchors, they became easier to control, easier to isolate, easier to move again if needed. This strategy also spread fear quietly. Those left behind never knew who would be next. Uncertainty kept people cautious. Silence became survival. Open planning became too dangerous. By breaking emotional bonds early, The system ensured that resistance remained fragmented, pain was individualized, grief was isolated, and without shared loss, shared action became almost impossible. Before we talk about disappearance, we need to understand how movement could happen without paper. The slave system relied on documentation, but it also knew how to bypass it when necessary. Informal transfers were the quiet back door. They left no receipts, no advertisements, and no official trace. Not every exchange went through an auction block. Some movements happened through personal agreements, family ties between enslavers, business favors, debts settled without money changing hands. A child could be sent rather than sold. The language was casual, but the impact was permanent. These transfers were rarely written down because writing created risk. Records could be questioned, challenged, used later in disputes. Silence protected both sides. If no sale existed, there was nothing to audit, nothing to inherit, nothing to argue over. Before we talk about networks, it's important to see how common informal cooperation was among enslavers. They shared tools, labor, information. They trusted one another more than the law in many cases. These relationships formed quiet pathways across counties and states. Private networks operated outside public markets. They moved people the same way they moved goods, quietly, efficiently, with minimal exposure. A child might be transferred as part of a favor, a training exchange, a promise to be returned that never was. This also explains why no buyer appears. There was no buyer. There was a recipient. Someone already known, someone already trusted. No price needed to be set publicly, because value was understood privately. Before we talk about intent, we need to understand how these networks benefited everyone involved. One plantation reduced risk, another gained trained labor. No money changed hands, no questions were asked, and no outsider could see what had happened. Informal transfers also made resistance harder. A child moved this way did not know where they were going. They had no context, no warning, no time to prepare. Their disappearance was immediate and complete. Because these networks avoided markets, they also avoided witnesses. Auctions drew crowds, records drew attention. Private transfers happened at night, or under the language of errands, or during routine travel. By the time anyone noticed, the child was already gone. This system did not need laws to function. It relied on trust between those in power and silence from those without it. And in that silence, entire lives could be moved, reshaped, and erased without leaving a single mark on paper. Before we talk about disappearance, we need to understand how movement could happen without paper. The slave system relied on documentation, but it also knew how to bypass it when necessary. Informal transfers were the quiet back door. They left no receipts, no advertisements, and no official trace. Not every exchange went through an auction block. Some movements happened through personal agreements, family ties between enslavers, business favors, debts settled without money changing hands. A child could be sent rather than sold. The language was casual, but the impact was permanent. These transfers were rarely written down because writing created risk. Records could be questioned, challenged, used later in disputes. Silence protected both sides. If no sale existed, there was nothing to audit, nothing to inherit, nothing to argue over. Before we talk about networks, it's important to see how common informal cooperation was among enslavers. They shared tools, labor, information. They trusted one another more than the law in many cases. These relationships formed quiet pathways across counties and states. Private networks operated outside public markets. They moved people the same way they moved goods, quietly, efficiently, with minimal exposure. A child might be transferred as part of a favor, a training exchange, a promise to be returned that never was. This also explains why no buyer appears. There was no buyer, there was a recipient, someone already known, someone already trusted. No price needed to be set publicly, because value was understood privately. Before we talk about intent, we need to understand how these networks benefited everyone involved. One plantation reduced risk. Another gained trained labor. No money changed hands. No questions were asked, and no outsider could see what had happened. Informal transfers also made resistance harder. A child moved this way did not know where they were going. They had no context, no warning, no time to prepare. Their disappearance was immediate and complete. Because these networks avoided markets, they also avoided witnesses. Auctions drew crowds, records drew attention. Private transfers happened at night, or under the language of errands, or during routine travel. By the time anyone noticed, the child was already gone. This system did not need laws to function. It relied on trust between those in power and silence from those without it. And in that silence, entire lives could be moved, reshaped, and erased without leaving a single mark on paper. But disappearance does not mean freedom. It does not mean escape. And it certainly does not mean death. The missing children were not lost by accident. They were removed from sight, erased from records, and placed into a system we are only beginning to understand. Every gap in the logs, every absence in the sales and runaway notices, every quiet transfer outside the market tells the same story: control, secrecy, and purpose. By following the pattern, we begin to see a larger truth, a truth that challenges the way history has been written and remembered. These children were part of a calculated system, one that measured value not just in labor or profit, but in obedience, loyalty, and the power to reshape lives quietly. What seems like disappearance is actually a deliberate strategy. What looks like absence is really evidence of something far deeper, something we are only beginning to uncover. If you found this exploration eye-opening, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us as we uncover more hidden truths, piece by piece, from the margins of history that were never meant to be seen.